Physiological basis of natural hygiene. Obviously it's impossible to trace the whole development of hygiene along physiological lines. I've more or less just selected a few random thoughts to show how the development of physiological science tends to vindicate the teachings of natural hygiene. Way back in 1947, when I was fortunate enough to win a state scholarship to university in England, I was of the opinion that anybody who had an IQ of less than 200 was a moron. Anyway, even though it was discovered that mine was only around about 140, I still didn't change my mind about it. However, over the years, and having studied scientific literature to some extent, I've now come to the conclusion that anybody with an IQ over about 120 is a moron, and anybody with it less than about 95 is an imbecile. So that means that the most rational people are usually those that with an IQ somewhere between 100 and 120. The reason I say this is because when one comes to read scientific literature, there are so many inaccuracies and so much muddled thinking that one has to realize that only the so-called intelligent people could make such serious blunders. Anyway, it has been suggested that the line between genius and insanity is a very fine one indeed, and this may be so. Most of us as logical creatures, I use that word logical advisedly because many of us tend to be illogical, but even the most logical of us always tend to associate cause and effect, or always attempt to associate cause and effect, and establish causal relationships between certain events and consequences. Some of you may, of course, be conversant with the work of the philosopher David Hume, who wrote quite lengthily on the subject of causal relationships, insisting that there was no such thing as cause and effect, and indeed that there was no such thing as a law of cause and effect. He argued the fact that one witnesses a certain effect following a so-called cause does not prove that such and such has a definite relationship. As an example, of course, he suggested that throwing a stone at a window and the window breaks does not prove that the stone broke the window, because one might repeat that experiment 1,000 times and you could never guarantee that the same thing would happen the next time you did it. Well, actually, Hume said a lot of this with his tongue in his cheek, and I think that his main contention, his main argument was to try to get us to think a little more than we usually do, and to realize that often the relationship between causes and effects is not as clear-cut as we often imagine, and that often effects follow multiple causes. Like many mistakes that people make are such as they often say, oh, I've caught a cold. They say, got my feet wet, you see, and developed a cold, and they think that they establish a causal relationship between the getting the feet wet and developing a cold. Well, that is a gross oversimplification. The causes which lead up to the development of a cold are much more complicated than the mere getting the feet wet. And this was one of the things that Hume was trying to bring to mind, the fact that the matter is far more complicated than we often think. And so in hygiene we find that although when we look into it on the surface it sounds very simple, the more we dig and the more we investigate and the more thoroughly we analyze the principles, we find that it is quite a profound philosophy, and it can become quite complex when one is tracing the subject to its roots. Now, hygiene has always taught a definite unity so far as the body's functions are concerned. That is to say, it has always argued that there is a total response in the body to every action and every function. that the body doesn't function along the lines of isolated autonomous parts, that every structure and every function is related to the function of the body as a whole. That is to say that if there is an acceleration of the heart beat, then there must be other compensating changes taking place elsewhere in the body, and that this must be related to the function of the body as a whole, and not merely as an isolated fragment. And they have always stressed this, even so far as symptoms are concerned, that a local symptom is not an expression of a local disease. The fact that the tonsils are inflamed and we have a sore throat does not necessarily mean that it's only the tonsils that are sick. Certainly that is where the symptom is manifested, but it is a local expression of a disturbance of the body as a whole. Now, getting to the subject of a somewhat serious disease which is becoming more and more prevalent in current civilization, that of cancer, it has always been argued medically that cancer is an autonomous growth, that it is a local disease, and that merely cutting it out or destroying it with X-rays, that is radical removal surgically or destruction through the use of electromagnetic waves, is satisfactory to get rid of it, to cure it, or to destroy it. Hygiene, of course, on the other hand, has never accepted this viewpoint and has always claimed that cancer is really the latest development in a pathological chain which may have evolved as far back as infancy. And for many years may have argued with medical specialists, medical practitioners as a whole on this particular point. And it's only quite recently that medicine has developed and accepted the idea that cancer is indeed an expression of a systemic condition. And I'd like to quote from the Lancet, 1964, August the 8th, which says that it used to be thought, and it is indeed by many medical people still thought, that tumours are autonomous. In other words, that they are independent of all constraints which maintain normal tissue equilibrium. This is fortunately dead, and it is high time it was buried. That's what the Lancet has to say. But cancer is definitely related to the body as a whole, and it is within the constraints of the whole organism. But strangely enough, although they say that this theory is dead, their practice is still based on that theory. That is, treatment with X-rays and radical removal by surgery. You unfortunately find that practice doesn't change for some half a century after theories have changed. And of course the same goes to a very great extent for other medical theories, even to the extent of the germ theory, which has now undergone serious modification by the medical profession. They are still practicing according to the view that germs are the basic universal cause of disease. Hygienists have even insisted that cancer, which I've mentioned, is the evolution of a pathological, the end point in the evolution of a pathological chain which develops early in life. Hygienists have always maintained also that disease, or the symptoms of disease, are associated with a defensive or a remedial or a reparative process within the body. And this, of course, is something which is rather radical, something that many people can't see, how a disease itself can be, shall we say, beneficial to the body. However, this has always been the hygienist viewpoint, and as I explained in an earlier talk in this series, the importance of disease as a remedial process. And I'd like to quote from a cancer specialist, Dr. William F. Koch, who is one of the most highly qualified people in the medical profession as a professor of medicine and a cancer specialist. And he states that it was only necessary to interview a large number of cancer patients to ascertain the fact that a toxic state exists before the cancer growth develops. Some patients complain of persistent severe headaches, neuritis, dizziness, spells of transient blindness, loss of balance, loss of mental vigor, various obscure aches and pains for as long as 20 years before the growth is found. In many cases, toxic goiter, pigmentations, changes in vascular condition, diabetes, indigestion, colitis, gastric ulcers, gastric disturbances, muscular weariness, and even muscular atrophy interfere with the correct health until the growth develops. Thus, any tissue of the body is subject to the action of the toxin. Our interviews with these patients, moreover, demonstrated that in as high as 80% of cases, these pre-growth symptoms of poisoning were much aggravated after the growth had occurred. They also go on to say that they also interfered with its development. Thus we came to recognize at least a partial protective success of the growth activity. This protective effect of the growth could not be overlooked. Now, the point that Koch is making there, he goes on with a long screed about this particular mechanism, but the point he was trying to make was that the actual growth of the tumour was a protective measure that the body had employed, and that it was in actual fact involved in walling off the toxins and preventing the tissues from being damaged further by the highly toxic state. That is possibly one of the more revolutionary viewpoints that have been put forward in recent years, which tend to support the hygienist view. Koch is quite well known in medical circles, and his views are respected. He is not one of the people who have broken away from orthodoxy in any way, but he has established this very important principle in relation to cancer. We as hygienists, of course, would push the principle still further and insist that all disease can be reconciled with bodily activity in the same way. In recent years, it has become medical practice to view two important pathological developments somewhat differently from their earlier tendencies. These two processes are fever and inflammation. In the case of fever, it was originally thought that the most urgent thing is to get the temperature down. And early practice centered around the process of reducing the fever one way or another. That as soon as people became feverish, there was a need for a certain amount of anxiety and immediate urgent treatment. This, of course, is not now the fashion. The tendency now is to recognize quite definitely the, shall we say, remedial importance of fever, and the fact that the body produces a fever for a definite reason. And it's important that we do understand the rationale of fever, that the increase in bodily temperature is associated with an increased need for cellular activity, that the metabolism of the body is accelerated in fever, the elimination of waste is accelerated in fever. We find that the development of fever is associated with two important processes, that is, an acceleration in the metabolic processes, and secondly, a suspension of heat loss through the skin. You find that the person who becomes feverish, the skin is often dry although hot. And it's not until the body wishes to reduce the fever that we get what the lysis, or when the fever breaks and the person's skin starts to perspire. They sweat. And of course when they sweat, the fever comes down again, because the skin, a suspension of skin activity, or the suspension of perspiration is no longer necessary, and in order to get the fever down, the body will permit sweating. And here it's important to note that we generally don't approve of the usual practices in fever of bathing the person with cold packs and so on in an effort to increase skin elimination, as many do, when one can easily observe that every effort is being made by the body to prevent this particular process by restricting the various glands which are associated with the elimination of water. Perspiration is checked, and therefore there's no point in forcing it. This has now, of course, become general practice in medicine to allow fevers to remain, but there is a certain amount of hesitancy about it, because they don't like them to go too high. Actually, it is, as I think I have mentioned previously, virtually impossible for the fever to go too high, because at a certain degree of fever, the activity of the cell is automatically checked. It is suspended, because the various enzymes, some 100,000 enzymes which are present within the cell, carrying on the 1,000 to 2,000 chemical processes that occur each minute, these enzymes, their activity is suspended under conditions of fever, and consequently, as the temperature rises to a certain degree, the activity of the cell is temporarily interfered with, and before it can continue satisfactorily, the temperature must fall. So there is an automatic check on the height to which fever can rise. A lot, of course, depends on the external temperature, the temperature of the environment. Furthermore, there has been a revolutionary change in the outlook towards inflammation. Inflammation is no longer subjected to the same shall we say, heroic treatment as it used to be. That is, acute inflammations. There's still a tendency to deal with chronic inflammations in the same way, but acute inflammations have been looked upon somewhat differently, although once again the actual practice was not yet caught up with the theory, and acutely inflamed organs are just as rapidly removed or the inflammation suppressed as they used to be. But you will find in most of the current texts on inflammation, various books on pathology and so on, they look upon inflammation as being a definite defensive and remedial process that the body institutes in order to remove irritants and repair damages. If this be the case, of course, we must ask, well, why try to interfere with the inflammation? As I mentioned earlier, some of the more important changes that have taken place in medicine and biological thought over recent years has been their somewhat modified attitude to the germ theory of disease and the role of bacteria in the development of disease. Naturally enough, the original germ theory, which was partially formulated by Pasteur and Koch towards the latter part of the middle of the last century, this came about at a time when Darwin was developing his theory of evolution along with Wallace and Huxley, and in the light of this different understanding of man as a whole and his relationship with nature, the germ theory took on rather quickly in its rather primitive form, that the germ is an agent of transmitting, communicating disease, and this is the actual cause. At long last, science has discovered the cause, and the only thing to do is to wipe out the bacteria, and then we have then removed disease. Well, as Dr. Dubos points out in his article in the Scientific American, many hygienists at the time wouldn't go along with this and said that bacteria plus host equals disease is a definitely false equation. And it is certainly true that the hygienists did put up rather a battle against this theory at the particular time, but in view of its coming along at a time when evolution was gaining ground and Huxley was suggesting that nature was red in tooth and claw and it was the survival of the fittest and the weakest to the wall and all that type of thing. Well, it tended to add impetus to the germ theory, and it flourished quite avidly at that time. And the whole of current medical science is virtually based on this particular theory. But as I say, there has been a somewhat thoroughgoing change in this, and modifications have been made, even to the extent that one might think that a person well acquainted with hygiene had written certain sections of this book. This is a current text on bacteriology, bacteria and mycotic infections in man. It's a university text which is used at the various colleges and universities. And I'd like to read a short passage from this, because it tends to confirm what we have been teaching for a long, long time. It's a section dealing with the evolution and the ecology of microbial diseases. There are a few words that you might not necessarily understand, and I'll make a sort of translation as I go along. But he starts off by discussing infection versus disease. He says, the mechanism through which microbial agents reach their potential victims and elicit pathological reactions are known in their broad outline, but this knowledge has not yet been reconciled with the fact, now well established, that extremely virulent bacteria are often present in the tissues of normal individuals who exhibit neither signs nor symptoms of disease. Today, the most puzzling problem of medical bacteriology is no longer how do bacteria cause disease, but rather why do bacteria so often fail to cause disease after they have become established in the tissues. He goes on to say that, curiously enough, this question is rarely asked, and even more rarely submitted to any experimental analysis. One of the reasons for the neglect may be found in the biologic philosophy on which the doctrine of medical bacteriology is based. And so he goes on to say that the theory of biological and sociological science, which has evolved from the days of Darwin and Huxley, reigns in modern medicine. And he says that the microbe, or the bacteria, is the aggressor, which invades the tissues. The body mobilizes its defenses. The physician is the disease fighter, whose goal is to achieve the conquest of disease. He says this attitude is a far cry from the Hippocratic view that health is universal harmony, and that the role of the physician is to restore equilibrium between the various components of the body and the whole of nature. Now we see there that he realizes that there is a rather sad discrepancy between our knowledge in biology and its application to the people as a whole in health and disease. And the fact that he illustrates the point about the bacteria, that they are aggressors, that they attack and invade the tissues, that the body mobilizes its defenses, and that the role of the physician is to fight and to conquer disease. It all, one of these things of constant struggle, of a fight going on between man and his environment, which of course is a sort of hangover from Darwin's theories on evolution. And of course, since Darwin, we've come along with people like Willis and Lienheimer, who have suggested that this struggle or this competition is not the actual answer in evolution, and yet there is abundant evidence that commensalism or cooperation or symbiosis is the rule, that there are many examples of harmony in nature where species are cooperating in order to produce an equable environment for all of them. And we find this, of course, in the body. Following Darwin's theories, we found that the body was often described as a unit of various competitors, that the liver was competing with the heart for blood, and that the lungs were competing with the heart for blood, and various organs of the body were competing with each other for nourishment and so on. Well, this was a natural outgrowth of the popular superstitions, but today, of course, the body is being recognized more and more as a unit, as an excellent example of economy and harmony. And I feel that this is indeed a welcome change. I have spoken throughout these talks about the various laws of life and the need to understand the laws of life and the basic principles of hygiene. And I think that this is a particular time when it might be desirable to bring to your attention some of these laws that we have been speaking about. I'm not altogether happy with the formulation of the various laws. Most of them are my own formulation, and consequently there might be a few inadequacies about them, but I do feel that as I have formulated them, they do express the general principles about which I have been talking this past few weeks. Some 70 or 80 years ago, one of the more illustrious hygienists, Dr. Robert Walter, wrote a book which he entitled Life's Great Law. And this book was dealing with a need to understand the laws of life, and particularly the main law which he insisted upon. And I feel that his formulation at the time was not terribly satisfactory, and I personally have attempted a reformulation of this, which I have stated as such: that every cell in the living organism is endowed with an instinct of self-preservation, sustained by a force inherent in the organism, the success of whose work is directly proportional to the amount of the force and inversely to the degree of its activity. Probably better explain that, as when laws are formulated naturally enough, a certain amount of explanation is desirable. But every cell in the body itself possesses a force which is inherent in that cell. That is, the fact that it's alive. We don't know what life is, but we do know that it exerts power, that it's a force, and that this force is absent when the organism dies. Now, the success of the work of this particular power is directly proportional to the amount of the force or the ability of the to express it, and it's inversely proportional to the degree of its activity. That is to say, if we cause it to work too much, then the amount diminishes, it becomes exhausted, it can become depleted. Examples of this, of course, are, for instance, if we give a person a laxative, we can force the bowels to act, and the degree of action that body will manifest will be directly proportional to the amount of force the body has. The more we make it work, that is inversely to the degree of its activity, the more we make that bowel work by forcing it with laxatives, the less it will be capable of working later. That is why people who have been taking laxatives for many years often have to increase the dose, because it no longer has the effect that it did in the beginning. And of course this can be said of anything, not only of laxatives, this can be said of any influence or any material. So this, we can say, is a basic law of life, that it is in itself an illustration of a hygienic principle. Another law is the law of action, which I have previously dealt with in a talk, that whenever action occurs within the living body as a result of an extraneous material or influence, the activity must always be ascribed to the living body and not to the material or influence. Now, an example of this, I can give the same example once again of the laxative. We give a person a laxative and there's a vigorous bowel action, but we cannot ascribe the action to the laxative. We must ascribe the action to the living body. If we take an emetic and we vomit, we can't say that the emetic supplied the action. we must ascribe the action to the body itself. Only the living thing is capable of acting, and not the inert thing. If we give a laxative or an emetic to a dead man, nothing happens, because it has no power, the body has no power of action. So in the law of action we must always insist that it is the living body that acts, and not the medicine or the food or the influence or material which we may supply. Another law which I've formulated, which once again I'm not altogether happy about, but it does convey the thought, is the law of distribution. In proportion to the importance and needs of the various organs and tissues of the body is the power of the body, whether much or little, apportioned among them. That is to say that obviously the body must to some extent distribute its energies. We may give an example of this. For instance, if you're in a house and you have a water system and you turn a tap on and you're running water out of it, and then you go and turn all the other taps on, the force of the water will naturally diminish the more taps you turn on. It's the same with the body. The more avenues of expenditure of your energy you select, the sooner will you become exhausted, and the less energy will you display through any particular avenue. That is to say that if the heart is feeble and we stimulate it, we force it to act. We haven't supplied action from outside, we've merely forced the heart to work harder, and as a result of that, other functions of the body must suffer. There must be, well, I'll give a better example than that, perhaps by, if I have my hand and I place a hot pack on the hand, it immediately or very shortly becomes reddened. That is to say, there's a local hyperemia. More blood is brought to this part. But we can't bring more blood to this part without depriving some other part of the blood. And unfortunately, the whole therapeutic hypothesis is based on this particular practice, that we use local treatments without realizing the effect that these local treatments may have on the rest of the organism. A person may have a feeble heart. We may stimulate it just a little. We increase its activity. But at the same time, we have depleted the basic power of the body. And we have interfered with the energy functions in other parts of the body. So there, this principle of distribution comes in, that the body is attempting all the while to apportion its energies in such a way that those parts in greatest need will receive the greatest amount under the particular circumstances. As the circumstances change, the body will redistribute its energies. We find this, for instance, in the case of a person who's walking through the jungle, and they may be confronted with a tiger, if they're unlucky enough. And of course, naturally, the person becomes frightened. As a result of this fear, certain changes take place within the body. Adrenaline is discharged from the suprarenal glands. The muscles become dilated, the blood vessels in the muscles become dilated, the heart respiration, pulse increase. The body has redistributed its energies. It has redistributed its circulatory channels to meet the particular needs at that time. This is following the law of distribution. The digestive tract is virtually deprived of energy, and the person loses their appetite. The mouth becomes dry, the saliva dries up. Well, naturally enough, this is an example of the law of distribution, and it's a necessary thing. If one sits down at the table, comfortable, warm, and emotionally poised to enjoy a meal, then we eat the meal. The energies of the body are diverted towards the digestive tract, towards the processes of digesting, absorbing, circulating and distributing the food. Here again is another example of the law of distribution. The law of dual effect I have more or less based on Newton's third law of motion, but in relating it to the living organism there have been one or two modifications. I state here that the secondary effect of a defensive action of the living organism against any injurious material or influence is exactly opposite and equal to the primary effect. Now, we cannot have our cake and eat it. If we stimulate the body, if I may once again use an example, if we take a drug, merci beaucoup, monsieur. Thank you. That's not accurate, pure. This law of dual effect, which as I say is closely linked with Newton's third law of motion, if we slightly stimulate the heart, we get an increase in its activity. But if we watch it carefully and check it with a stethoscope or check the pulse, we will notice that subsequently, when the effect of this stimulant is wearing off, we get an actual reduction in its activity. That it starts to falter, slow down, and once again we have to stimulate it. And this is the common practice, to stimulate and re-stimulate. The person will often say that they need to smoke because tobacco steadies their nerves. They don't realize that it's the previous smoking that unsteadied them in the first place. The person takes a drink to give him strength. It's the previous drinking that's made him weak. And we notice that the secondary effect of all these things is equal and opposite to the primary effect. We take a drink, we feel stimulated and excited. The alcohol, the being a poison, will create a mild fever, so-called warms us, but afterwards we become chilled. This can easily be checked. We find that if we are stimulated, a person may become overexcited, but later they feel exhausted. There's always this secondary effect, which is equal and opposite to the primary effect, and we must always watch this in dealing with the sick and with therapeutics. The sick have greater limitations naturally than the well, and if we take a person who is very sick, we will find that even a mild excitement will subsequently produce an aggravation of symptoms and even exhaustion. I can never stress too much the need for conserving energy so far as the sick are concerned. People at my place often think that I'm being unduly pedantic when I insist that they sit in their own rooms, that they keep warm and they keep quiet, and that they don't have visitors when they're having their meal, that they don't indulge in any conversation. They think that it's being a bit too extreme. It isn't. It's definitely necessary. The energies of the body must be always, when a person is sick, if they're going to get well, they must be conserved. And this law of dual effect expresses how and why stimulants have the effect that they do. You can always notice that following any excitement, if we become elated or we become unusually strong as a result of a certain stimulus, afterwards we will feel exhausted. Strength or power is only recognized in its expenditure. For instance, we are growing weaker when we feel strong or when we feel strength. If a person goes to lift a heavy weight, they are manifesting tremendous power, but at the same time they are weakening themselves. When we are resting, when we feel that complete relaxation, we actually feel tired and exhausted, and you know how you lie on your bed sometimes, thoroughly relaxed, and you can feel your limbs and your whole body as if it were aching. Well, actually, although you feel weak at that time, you're actually accumulating strength. So the feeling of weakness is often associated with regaining strength. The feeling of strength is certainly associated with the expenditure of power and a growing an actual state of growing weaker. These two things are not often connected in this way. Another law which we formulated is the law of limitation. Now, whenever the expenditure of vital power has advanced so far that a fatal termination is imminent, a check is put upon the expenditure of all power not associated with the maintenance of life. Now one knows that under certain conditions a sick person may go into a coma. All the reflexes are absent, they're unconscious, there is loss of all the various senses. You can open the eyes but they don't see anything, you can make a noise, they don't hear anything. There's a complete withdrawal of all consciousness. The energies of life have been so exhausted, they've got to such a degree that in order to maintain life, every activity, every form of expending energy must be checked in order to maintain life. People may remain in comas for days and weeks, and at the end they will recover. We know that various grandstand efforts that are made to revive people from comas often result in death. The reason, of course, being that the body's energies are being forced beyond the point where they can hold out. I remember reading a story many years ago of Dr. Henry Lindler, one of the early practitioners of natural therapeutics. His son was involved in a very serious motor accident, and so firmly convinced was Dr. Lindler that the let-alone treatment was the best. He sat by his boy's bedside for 8 days, never did a thing. And eventually the boy came out of the coma. Now Dr. Lindler was an MD, and he had all his colleagues around him, prevailing upon him to stimulate the boy, to give him this and to give him that, and to force him to bring him out of the coma. But Dr. Lindler was quite a wise fellow, and he realized that he was not going to enhance the energies of life by stimulating the boy. But the most important thing at that time was to leave the energies of life alone and allow the boy to recuperate. In the work of Dr. Isaac Jennings, who has written Philosophy of Health and The Tree of Knowledge, one or two other books, he gives numerous examples of his own practice where people were in comas, and as a result of leaving them alone, he was able to help them to eventually get well. And he shows how the number of deaths that occur as a result of comatose states where the patient is stimulated into activity and the consciousness is forced, how it commonly results in death. So that is an excellent example of the law of limitation. But nevertheless, this law is even applicable to a point where coma hasn't arisen. Another law which is associated with economy within the body is the law of economy. The living organism, under favourable circumstances, stores up excess vital funds above the current expenditure as a reserve to be employed in a time of special need. Now we all know that under certain circumstances we seem to manifest unusual feats of strength and endurance. That the body can be subjected to tremendous stresses and we can still come through. In fact, you can see this today often in the abuse of the sick. What some people have to tolerate is quite amazing. Only today I went to the newspaper shop to purchase the daily fiction, and usually, at least I recognise that for the last few weeks a lady who used to serve me was no longer there, so I inquired of the gentleman where the lady was. And he said, "Oh, unfortunately she isn't well, she's in hospital at the present moment." So I asked what the trouble was, and he said, "Yes," he said, "she hasn't been well for a year or two." He said, "First of all they took out her appendix, but she didn't seem to be any better, so they removed her gallbladder." And he said that she still wasn't any better, so now he said they've taken half her stomach away. And they found some ulcers. He said that she's not feeling any better yet, she's still in hospital, and it looks like they might have to operate again as there are still other ulcers. Well, here we can see that unless this person had a tremendous amount of reserve of energy stored up within the body, available for times of special need, it would never have withstood this abuse. And unfortunately the sick are abused more than any other animal on earth. And the body has to withstand this abuse. Not only this, you find in athletes, marathon runners. I remember way back in 1948 at the White City in London, the Olympic Games were held in London. A marathon runner came staggering into the arena after 26 miles. He was virtually unconscious on his feet. He just didn't make the last quarter mile and collapsed and was overtaken. And he finally recovered. But the body has to have tremendous reserves to withstand that type of abuse. And many athletics are nothing more than abuses. It's certainly true that a man can run a mile in 4 minutes. But to do so, he has to really push himself very hard to draw on his reserves. And it's as well to know that we do have these reserves, although I don't think that athletic activities should be occasions of special need. I think there are so many other stresses in modern life that we should save our reserves for these more necessary things. The final law I've formulated is the law of adaptation. Now this is an extremely important one and is applicable very readily. The instinctive, self-preservative action of the living organism is capable of adaptation to any injurious material or influence it cannot escape or destroy in order to conserve vital funds and sustain life. What do we mean by that? Well, what I mean is this. This law can quite easily be related to others, and I can use similar examples. If a person who's a young person starts to smoke, commonly the action of the body will be a violent one. They will cough. It will be unpleasant to the taste. They may even develop a headache. They may become giddy or dizzy. They may even vomit. If they felt anything like I felt, they'll feel really sick. But certainly the activities of the body warn in an unmistakable manner that the smoking is not desirable, that it isn't wanted. Now, if of course the person is foolish enough to persist with the habit, they will find that after several attempts, or after a few days, an adaptation takes place within the body, that the body no longer resists the tobacco or the influence of the tobacco in such a dramatic and vigorous manner. Well, obviously here, in the first place, the body manifests coughing, possibly, headache, vomiting, dizziness, feverishness. All of these things may occur as a result of the poisoning. But these activities occasion a tremendous expenditure of energy. The body can't afford to go on expending its energy in this way. So what happens? In order to sustain life and conserve its energies, it can't overcome the poison, it can't escape it, it can't destroy it. So it has to, shall we say, learn to live with it. It has to adapt itself. As a result of this, certain thickenings of the mucous membranes, hardening of the tissues, indurations take place, so that less of the poison is actually getting into the body, and the body forms this adaptation. Other examples of this, of course, are the fact that my hands, from delicate guitar playing and so on, are extremely soft and tender owing to the nature of my work. If I were to go out tomorrow and start to chop trees down, no doubt by the end of the day my hands would be blistered, sore, bleeding, and quite uncomfortable. Now, that bleeding, the inflammation, the infusion of fluid into the tissues, the edema, the swelling, the blisters, that's expenditure of energy. The body has to construct these things. It has to alter its circulation. It has to construct these blisters and then diffuse the fluid into the tissues. Now, it can't escape this influence. It can't destroy it. So it's got to learn to live with it. So I continue for a few weeks chopping trees down, and I find I no longer have bleeding and blisters and diffusion of fluid and soreness and tenderness. Instead, the skin on my hand thickens. I develop calluses. The body has protected itself. It's adapted itself to a condition that it couldn't escape or overcome or destroy. Naturally enough, this adaptation has been a good thing under the circumstances, but it's not a good thing from the point of view of my guitar playing, because my sensitive fingers are no longer sensitive, and owing to the thickening of the skin, the nerve endings are not as sensitive as they should be, and their hands are no longer any use for more delicate work. You've probably seen the hands of these people who practice karate, where they can just crack their hand against a row of bricks or something and crack it, or they can put their fist through a stone wall. But of course, at the same time, the hand is no longer a delicate and complicated mechanism for performing very delicate and fine work. They can no longer do this. So you always have to pay a price for these adaptations, which are always adaptations away from the ideal. The body is no longer in an ideal state when it is like this, when it is adapted. If you drink a lot of coffee or a lot of tea, you'll find that the sense of taste will be impaired. You'll no longer be able to appreciate, if you can at the moment, the delicate flavours in certain fruits and vegetables. You'll find that the mucous membrane throughout the alimentary canal has become thicker. As I've mentioned earlier, if you take a laxative and you continue to take it, you find that the bowels don't improve, they get worse. You have to take more and more of the laxative and stronger laxatives, because the fact that this poison occasions a vigorous emptying of the bowels and vigorous effort on the part of the body. The body reaches a stage where it can no longer afford to expend its energy in this way, and as a result of this it has to curb its energy. Therefore it learns to live with it, it adapts itself. So thus we have this basic law of adaptation. But as I say, this law, whilst operating in this way, affords us an example of the way the body can learn to live with things, but at the same time its highest functions and the highest capabilities that it can achieve are at the same time lost. Now, generally speaking, hygiene as a whole is based on certain physiological principles such as these, that it has a definite physiological basis. Now, you hear quite frequently talk about the laws of life and how we become sick through breaking the laws of life and so on. I'd like to insist that it's impossible to break the laws of life. Has anybody heard of anybody breaking the law of gravity? If you walk out of a third-story window, you don't break the law of gravity, you prove it. If you can do all sorts of things that are wrong and you become sick, you don't break the laws of life, you prove them. If you could do everything that was wrong and not to become sick and not incur any damage to the body, then you would be breaking the law, but that's not possible. If a law is a law, it cannot be broken. Whichever way it goes, you prove it, whether you stay well or you stay sick. According to hygiene, of course, if one knows the laws of life and you try to live, shall we say, to provide the best degree of health according to those laws, then you will be healthy. If you live in a manner which is not in conformity with these laws, or not in conformity with the highest ideals of the laws, then you become sick. If you have sufficient knowledge, you should be able to provide health or disease at will. So these laws are but a help or an indication of the way we should look after ourselves, or the way in which we should attempt to live. Now I would suggest that as we more or less come to the end of this series of talks, I hope that you've been able to learn a few things from them, and that the information that you now have with regard to these various principles will enable you to, shall we say, not only analyze but also synthesize or put together all the bits of information that I've tried to impart over the last 3 months. And in this way it should be possible for you to attempt to live a life which will be productive of greater health, more happiness, and a more extensive life. Thank you.